An important aspect of transforming objects is the position and orientation of an object's pivot. The pivot is the point in space around which the transformations will occur. So let's start by adding a box to the scene, and I'll do that from the Shelf tab, and I'll hold down Control as I click on it so that the box is added straight into the scene at the world origin. Now let's say that we want this box to be sat directly on top of the reference grid. And we can see if we look in the operations toolbar above the scene view here, that the box has a size of 1 meter in each axis. So let's move it up in the scene by 0.5 meter. And I'll do that in the viewport by holding middle mouse over the Y axis and dragging to the right until I see a value of 0.5 in the value ladder. And now we've got the base of the box sat directly on the reference grid. The box's pivot point is currently right in the center of this box, which we can get a sense of as I orbit my viewport around the box. But I think this will actually be easier to see if I switch the shading mode to a wireframe. We're going to be talking about shading modes in a few lessons time, but for now I just want to switch to wireframe so that we can better see the pivot point in relation to the geometry. We can switch to wireframe by either tapping the W key whilst hovering the cursor over the viewport, or we can come over to this display options drop down and I'll select from here wireframe ghost. Now we can more clearly see that this transform handle is positioned right in the center of this object. If I switch to the rotate tool by tapping the R key, we get the rotation axis handles, and at the very center of the handle we get this small purple point, which indicates the point around which the rotations will be performed. And this point is the pivot point. So if I click and drag on one of these axis handles, we can see the box being rotated around that purple point. If I switch to the scale tool, we can see that the box is being scaled around that point. I'm going to switch my view back to smooth shaded mode, which I'll do by tapping the W key. And let's take a look at a situation where we might want to move the pivot point from its default location of being at the center of the box. Let's say with the box sat on this reference grid that we want to rotate the box around this edge here as though it's being pushed in this top left hand corner, and so it would effectively need to rotate around this edge. And so to achieve that, we're going to need to move the pivot point to that edge so that the box will rotate around that point. We can enter the pivot manipulation mode by tapping either the insert key or the quotation mark key. And to get the quote key, we effectively use Shift plus the apostrophe key. We can also enter the pivot mode by right-clicking over the handle, and here we can select pivot mode. When we enter the pivot mode, the handle display changes, and we see we get both rotation and move handles at the same time. And also when we're in pivot mode, the arrow tips on the end of the move handles are shown in wireframe mode. Whereas if I exit the pivot mode and switch to the move tool, we see that the standard move handles have solid arrow tips. So I'll tap the insert key to enter pivot mode again, and I'll just hold down Control and drag on this Y axis handle to move the pivot down by 0.5 meter, and so that it's sat directly on the base of the box. Now I'll do the same and move the pivot 0.5 meter along the X axis, and now we have the pivot positioned right on this edge of the box. I'll switch to the rotate tool by tapping the R key, and now if I middle click over the Z rotation handle, and let's say rotate this through increments of 5 degrees, we can see the box rotates around that edge. And when we get to -90 degrees, we've pushed the box all the way over so that it's now sat on its side. Now if we go to scale the box by tapping the E key to bring up the scale tool, and then scale it uniformly, we can see that the box is scaling around that pivot point. And this is maybe even clearer to see if I scale it along its local Y-axis, and you can see it feels like it's scaling in just one direction because the pivot point is right on the edge of the box. We can move the pivot point anywhere in a scene. It doesn't have to be within the bounds of the object. So if I tap the insert key to enter the pivot mode again and move the pivot away from the object and then exit pivot mode and switch to the rotate tool, we can see that we're rotating the box around this point in space. And the same if I go to scale it, you can see that it's scaling around this point in space. We can also rotate the pivot, and let's drop down another box to look at that. In fact, I'll just move this one out of the way first and then control click on the box icon in the Create Shelf tab. Now let's say that we want to be able to move this box along an axis which is 45 degrees to the world axis. We know that if we rotate the box itself through 45 degrees, then with the handle aligned to object, that will allow us to do that. But it may be the case that we want to keep the geometry in its original alignment. So in the case of this box, so that its sides continue to run parallel to the world. but while still being able to constrain its movement along this 45-degree axis. We can do that by rotating the pivot. I'll undo that rotation by tapping Ctrl Z, and I'll tap the Insert key to enter pivot mode, and then rotate the pivot through 45 degrees. And I'm holding down the Control key to give me that 45-degree angle increment. Now I can tap the Insert key again to exit the pivot mode, and I can move the box along its local Z-axis, which is now at 45 degrees to the world Z-axis, but the geometry itself is still in its original alignment relative to the world. You'll see that we do have the ability to enter translation and rotation values for the pivot in the parameters view, but for general scene layout work, it's often faster and more intuitive to work with manipulating an object's pivot position and rotation in the viewport. I'll just quickly try and demonstrate this. So I'll take this box that we've already rotated the pivot for, and I'll move it along its Z-axis by 5 meters. And let's say that now I want to rotate it around a point that's 2 meters directly above it along the Z-axis. So I can just tap the Insert key and rotate the pivot point back to its original alignment and move it up by 2 meters in Z. Then I'll tap Insert again, and now I can rotate the box around that point. Now let's try and do the same thing, but just working in the parameter view. I'll drop down a new box straight at the origin and rotate the pivot by 45 degrees around the Y-axis in the parameter view. And then I'll translate it by 5 meters along the Z-axis. Now I want to rotate the pivot back to 0 and move it -2 meters in Z. So I'll enter 0 in the pivot rotation again, and we can see that rather than leaving the box where we positioned it and rotating the pivot just like we did in the viewport, the box has moved to a position of 5 meters along the Z-axis. That's because the parameter view isn't automatically recording our actions in the parameter view as a series of steps, as it does when we're working in the viewport. It just simply allows us to enter a single set of values at a time. So if you look at the values we have, with a pivot rotation of 0, it's simply moving the box by 5 meters along the Z-axis. If we did want to achieve the same result in the parameter view that we've achieved by transforming this box in the viewport, then we have to store the current transforms as a pre-transform at every step. If I rotate the pivot back to 45 degrees around the Y-axis, so that we're back to that first same step that we performed in the viewport, then what I have to do at this point is clean the transforms by selecting Clean Transforms from this drop-down menu. And you'll see that cleaning the transforms resets these values back to 0, and it stores the existing values in the background as a pre-transform. If I come to this drop-down menu again and extract the pre-transform, you can see those previous transform values that we had get restored. Now, if I clean the transforms again to store this current transformation as a pre-transform again, I can now reset the pivot rotation back to 0 and move it -2 meters along the Z-axis, and then I can rotate the box 45 degrees around the Y-axis. So whilst it's completely possible to work in this way using the parameter view, it does require you to understand and keep on top of what's happening with the pre-transform. Whereas when you work with the pivot in the viewport, Houdini automatically takes care of that pre-transform for you. We're going to be covering this topic of pre-transforms and how we use this drop-down to work with them in more detail once we get to the parenting and constraints module. And in that module, we'll also be looking at these other options on this transform panel, such as this transform order at the top here, and these parenting and constraint options at the bottom here. Houdini actually offers us an alternate method of achieving the kind of functionality that we've seen in this lesson. But rather than manipulating an object's pivot to achieve a specific position and orientation of our viewport handles, Houdini allows us to simply detach and adjust the position and orientation of the handles themselves, but without affecting the actual pivot of the object. For many modeling and scene layout tasks, this is usually a more desirable way to work, and we're going to take a look at this in the next lesson.